they're not failing. If things aren't going well, it just means that there's opportunities to learn, opportunities to tweak or shift. We are talking about real humans, and we're talking about raising humans that think differently, that act differently than what we've been taught or raised to believe parenting is going to be about.
Raising neurodivergent kids and teens who struggle with emotional regulation is tough. How can parents navigate the complexities of societal pressures and self-esteem when they feel like they're the ones falling short? And what are some essential strategies to establish that warm, connected relationship with a challenging child? Dayna Abraham, author of the newly released book, Calm the Chaos, is here to help us unravel these questions and provide insights on the emotional roller coaster that comes with raising a challenging child. That's straight ahead on episode 186. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris, and this is the Neurodiversity Podcast.
What is neurodiversity? You see the world differently.
Autism spectrum.
Gifted.
Complexities that are inherently inside.
ADHD.
Dysgraphia.
Tourette's.
All brains are different.
You are exactly what this world needs.
This is the
Neurodiversity
Podcast.
We're preparing to launch into the new school year, if you haven't already, and we are really excited to help all of the educators out there continue to advocate for and create neurodiversity-affirming schools. In just a few short weeks, we are going to be hosting a week-long free event for anyone who's interested. It's our crash course on creating neurodiversity-affirming schools, and we would love for you to join us. The events will be live and interactive, so you can talk to me, my expert guests, and the other people attending the event to think of new ways about how to shift your practice in the classroom to meet the needs of all your learners. If you want to make sure you don't miss out, be sure to click the link in the show notes and get yourself registered, and we will see you there. Okay, my conversation with Dayna Abraham is up next.
When I found the Neurodiversity Podcast, I was really kind of
desperate to learn about myself and understand myself.
Honestly, I wanted to find like a
tribe who I could relate to and feel like I fit in.
This podcast brings on guests who seem to be moving neurodiversity more
into the mainstream. And Emily Kircher-Morris is amazing.
I feel like she's talking straight to me.
Her knowledge about people who think differently is so refreshing. Everyone's different.
And the world needs to
understand them. And that's what the Neurodiversity
Podcast is doing.
Helping them understand
us.
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 Before getting into my conversation with Dayna, I do want to address one particular topic. Just a quick content warning that this episode does include some descriptions of restraint and educational trauma used in the schools. We didn't really have a chance to go into the topic of restraints being used in schools, but obviously this is a really difficult topic to talk about, and we just want to recognize the controversy that's associated there and how hard it can be for schools to have the money and the training appropriate to help the kids who need support. I'm happy to welcome Dayna Abraham to the show today. Dayna is author of the new book, Calm the Chaos, a fail-proof roadmap for parenting even the most challenging kids. So Dayna, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Emily, I'm so excited to be here.
You know, I think when we become parents, we have this imagined reality that parenting is kind of just all sunshine and rainbows. But as any of us can attest, you know, parenting is so much harder than it looks and can be kind of heavy because it can lead to some of those negative emotions just about the parenting experience in general. And that can be really tough when you're feeling isolated as a parent, especially when society has all of its opinions. I just want to start off and ask you about how parents can shake off that pressure and that stigma when they're parenting neurodivergent kids.
That's a really good question. And I think, like you mentioned, all parents go through this of the shoulda, coulda, woulda, and all of the blame and the shame and the judgment that comes from society and other people and maybe even our parents. But when you're parenting a neurodivergent kid, I feel like it's 10 to 20 times the pressure and the push to do things like everyone else. And so I think helping parents remind themselves that you are exactly the parent your child needs, and you are the expert in your own child. And sure, you might not know everything there is to know about what your child needs or how to support them, and you're still learning those things, but there is no better person than you to do that job. And then the second thing is grounding themselves in the fact that they're not failing, that if things aren't going well, it just means that there's opportunities to learn, opportunities to tweak or shift, but it doesn't mean that they are failing. We are talking about real humans, and we're talking about raising humans that think differently, that act differently than what we've been taught or raised to believe parenting is going to be about. And so there's going to be bumps in the road, and just realizing, okay, I can do this. I am not alone. There's an entire podcast I'm listening to that's all about raising neurodivergent children. And so I know I'm not the only one doing this. And if we can ground ourselves in that, I think it makes it easier to handle what I call storms, but the bumps in the road.
Yeah. That feeling of universality, just knowing that we're not alone. Tell me about your path to finding some of that community. Was that something that happened automatically for you, or was it something that took time?
No, I think I'm still navigating that with each of my kids in the quote unquote real world. I think it's a lot harder for me to find those communities because, just as an example, my daughter doesn't have a specific diagnosis, but she's 10 years old. She struggles with anxiety. She has really strong sensory preferences. And so the traditional schooling is really hard for her because it's overwhelming, and she doesn't like to raise her hand. She doesn't like to ask for help, but she loves learning, and she loves the idea of school, and she loves friends, but there's so much about it that's really hard. And so it was really hard to get her to go to school, and we really just focused on supporting her and her needs. And so if that meant we went to school an hour late, if that meant that we missed school for a day, then I was okay with that, because I would rather her be in a place where she can be receptive to learning, where she feels safe in her body, where she feels listened to and heard. And so the school, though, made me feel like I was the only one in the entire school who was struggling with this, and the only parent who couldn't get their kid to school. And I know from little side conversations here and there that that's just not the case, that there's far more kids who are struggling, far more kids who don't feel safe at school, who don't feel like they're being heard or their needs are being met at school. And we, the parents, are the ones left to blame. And that's me with the knowledge I have, the advocacy skills I have. And I think about the parents who don't have that privilege to have those things already in their toolkit and to have that ability to keep their kid at home. Mm-hmm. And they have to send their kids to school.
Yep.
And so I just want to acknowledge that even with my knowledge and with what I've gone through, I still struggle in the quote unquote real world to find those support systems. And so I find a lot of those support systems online. 10 years ago, when my son was really struggling, so he was kicked out of his first preschool, he was in trouble in kindergarten, and by second grade, he was kicked out of school more days than he was in school. He was having lots of aggressive meltdowns. He was eloping and leaving the school. He was doing all sorts of things. And the principal illegally told me that you can either let your son be taken into custody with this police officer, or you can take him home. Don't bring him back until you figure out what's wrong with him, quote unquote. And despite going through all the processes to get him an IEP and to get him the supports, he still wasn't being supported because they didn't quite know how to support a child who was neurodiverse like he is. And that was 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. And so when I came home to homeschool him, I started looking online, and everything was picture perfect, and do this and do that. And here's your reading room, and here's your homeschool agenda. And everything looked so perfect that I felt like I was the only one that didn't know what I was doing. And here I was with 12 years of classroom education, knowledge, child development. I had all this knowledge, but yet I couldn't help my own son. And so I decided to start our blog And the sole purpose was really selfish. I really just wanted to know there was one other person out there who was going through what I was going through. I didn't find one person. I found millions of people who were going through what I was going through. And now I've created an online community, and there are so many other communities out there. I saw just the other day that Walmart is having sensory days to do your shopping. 10 years ago, that would have been unheard of. And so the world is becoming more accepting, more understanding, more knowledgeable that we have all of these differences and these needs that our children have and that adults have. And so there is hope that there is community out there and there are others going through this.
I feel like that sense of community is so important because when you think about the connection between those societal expectations and also self-esteem, that emotional weight of falling short as a parent can really play into feelings of negativity. How do you feel like that whole feeling of maybe I'm not doing enough influences parents of neurodivergent kids? You mentioned it a little bit with your experience about trying to find that balance of what was right for your son, but how can parents have some resilience with some of that? How can they start on that journey?
Yeah, so I think it's really important, again, just to realize that this is really common of I'm not enough, I'm not doing enough, maybe I should be doing this, especially when you start to see people on social media, you see your friends, you see your cousins, all starting to have their kids meet different developmental milestones or different benchmarks in their ages. So my son that I just talked about is now 18. And so he just graduated high school, which is a huge milestone in the world, right? But the number one question I get is, well, what's he doing next? Is he going to college? Is he doing that? I said, nope, he's just taking some time. Oh, he's having a gap year. Nope, not a gap year. Like, this is just what's next in his life. He has so much educational trauma from what he's gone through.
Yep.
And he has so much that he has to unpack of what he's been told about himself and what he has had to navigate the last 18 years, that he deserves some downtime. And he will figure out what's next, but it will take some time, and we're not on a timeline. But boy, when he hit 18, or as he was heading up to 18, those thoughts of, I didn't do enough, he should be looking at colleges, or he should be getting a job, or he should be wanting to move out, or I should. And it got really heavy. And so I had to remind myself in the things that I teach my parents. The first thing is, one, focusing on progress, right? Tiny progress. I always tell parents, don't judge your progress on your worst day, because there are bad things that are difficult days that happen. And my son just had another meltdown. He hasn't had one in over a year. But if I say, what's the point of everything we're doing because he's just going to have another meltdown, I'm ignoring all the progress he's made in between. I'm ignoring the fact that his meltdown had minimal aggression and that we were able to get through it. He was able to calm down. His girlfriend was able to get him to a calm place, get him to able to verbalize what was going on and why he was upset. And then we were able to get through that moment and then reconnect. And it was a couple days later that we were able to reconnect, but we were able to reconnect, rebuild that relationship. But if I only judged it on, well, he's still having meltdowns, I guess I didn't help him at all, then I'm negating all the other progress and hard work that he's had along the way. So that's number one, is as parents of neurodivergent kids, we have to focus on those teeny tiny baby steps that we're making forward, not the 3 steps back and then the 1 step forward. But we have to look at that progress. We also have to really focus on our own mindset. And I know that sounds hokey pokey and all of that, but I think it's so important that we focus on our own perspective and our own thought shifts. And we use something, I talk about it in the book and we do it in our program, and it's called thought monsters and super swaps. And so depersonalizing these thoughts and ideas that we have, and I'm neurodivergent myself, so I can go on a worry loop like no one's business, and I can really go down that spiral. So having these thought monsters that I can pull out and say, oh, I noticed that cyclone is here, or I noticed that the always and never beast is happening, or, oh, I'm letting Judgy McJudgerson get to me. It takes it off of it being about me and it being shameful and it being something I'm judging myself again about. And instead I can say, oh, this is a common thought, a common belief, a common thing that happens. Now, who can I call on to help me? And so we can call on some super swaps. So for Judgy McJudgerson, that's like this idea of everybody else's opinions and thoughts, those sorts of things. And so you pull in Wah Wah Warrior, or you can pull in Progress Princess. Got a couple of others. The Sparkler, who focuses on what's going well and what you're doing. So instead of all these things are, you should be doing this, what's wrong with your parenting, you're ruining your child, you're setting them up for failure. All these things we hear or we think we hear, right? Mm-hmm. We just assume that's what people are thinking when they see our child doing whatever they're doing or not meeting these milestones. We assume that other people are thinking, wow, what's wrong with you? What's wrong with your kid? And sometimes they just come out and say those things, which those people, I like to use the Wah Wah Warrior, which just turns all their words into Charlie Brown noise. And so it just goes, wah, wah, wah. Like, all right, you do not matter to me. And then for the ones where we are starting to believe that maybe they're right, maybe we should have done this or we could have done this, pulling in that Progress Princess or pulling in the Sparkler to say, I am the best parent for my kid. I know my kid. I am here for my kid. And the more that we can ground ourselves in those beliefs, the more receptive, the more compassionate, the more accepting, the more in tune we can be with our kids, because it removes that barrier that we might be having to being able to show up for our kids. Because if we enter a situation, let's say my daughter's school refusal, and I'm like, you're never going to go to school. They're going to call the truancy office. They're going to think I'm the worst parent ever. If I'm worried about that, I'm not worried about my daughter and I'm not meeting her needs. So we have to address those thoughts first so that we can meet our kids' needs.
I want to go back to something that you kind of mentioned and just dig into it a little bit about educational trauma, because that's a term I have used. And to be honest, I've gotten pushback from people, usually those not in the neurodiversity community, that it's unreasonable to think that just because someone had a less than ideal school experience, that is somehow traumatic. But I know, both from my own experiences personally growing up, but also from the work that I've done with my clients, that there is trauma that occurs for a lot of these kids. Can you share a little bit more about that?
So first and foremost, I'm not blaming schools or administrators. No. I was a teacher to begin with. Yeah. And I was never trained in how to create a safe place and how to meet the needs of all my kids. I was taught classroom management skills. Mm-hmm. That's not the same thing. And so when I talk about educational trauma, which I've not really heard a lot of people talk about or name, it's just a name I've kind of come up with for what my son has gone through. But my son was put in isolation rooms. So white rooms with nothing in them, just the pipes, just the walls. My son was locked in closets. My son was grabbed. My son was put in rooms that where he was put on display, glassed-in rooms inside of an office where people are walking by, watching him have a meltdown. My son was put in the prone position, knees on his back. I mean, we already know that there are children who have lost their lives with those types of holds. And I don't know who can listen to that list of things that have happened and not feel the trauma. With his meltdown the other day, it's not educational, but he jumped out of the car. Mm-hmm. We were driving down the road and he started to open the door while I was driving. And luckily I stopped. I stopped the car, pulled into a parking lot. He opened the door and he jumped out. And flooding back, all these memories came into my head, and it triggered this trauma that I didn't even realize existed from when he was 7 and he would jump out of the car. Mm-hmm. Because there's this fear that's just laying under the surface that we don't sometimes even realize is there. And so I'm using that example because that's what this educational trauma is for my son, is that there was always this underlying fear that he's going to be grabbed, that he's going to be pushed, that he's going to be locked in a room, that he's going to be isolated, that he's going to be kicked out of school, right? That this place was no longer going to be for him. And so he was always on high alert. So he would easily be triggered just if he assumed he was in trouble.
Mm-hmm.
I just don't know how you can listen to a list like that and not go, oh my gosh, yeah, that would definitely cause some unresolved struggles and challenges, call it trauma or not, in someone's body and how they process the world around them.
I think part of what I notice so much about the schools is that the behavioral techniques that we use are so baked into our schools. When you suggest to teachers that there are other ways to support a classroom of learners, they honestly don't always know where to go with that. I mean, I remember when I was a school counselor, we had a psychologist who worked in our district who actually worked very closely with Ross Greene. And he was telling us, and he said, you know, you don't need to have a behavior management system in your classroom. And for what it's worth, my mind was kind of blown a little bit. Why hadn't I ever thought of that before? Like, I knew how damaging that was for me as a child. I knew I saw kids who it was harmful toward, but having somebody just verbalize that to me was a huge shift. When you have a child who is constantly in trouble or fearful that something is going to happen, and they have that hypervigilance and that elevated level of anxiety all the time because they don't know what changes are going to happen. They don't have the executive functioning skills to manage the expectations that they're going to get in trouble. Like all of these pieces, even if it's not necessarily big T trauma, but that little T trauma, it impacts those kids.
100%.
We just have to find that awareness of looking at these kids in these situations in different ways.
I would hope that the education system is starting to change. And, you know, the fact that you had a psychologist at your school that, you know, worked closely with Ross Greene, that gives me hope. But you're so right, it's baked into the education system. And the education system was really, especially here in the United States, was built because we needed conformity, we needed soldiers, and we needed workers to go into the factories. And we don't need that right now. And a lot of our education is shifting to multidisciplinary and meeting the different learning needs, but we're not meeting the different body needs, the different neurodiversity needs. Like we're not meeting that yet. And so I think that's the next rung of where we can help teachers, where we can help educators. And as a parent, we can advocate for and educate on the different ways to see our kids, the different perspective to help them realize that the children are not doing this to purposely disturb the classroom. If they're acting out, there is a reason. And we have to look for the underlying reason of why this is happening instead of just saying it's coming out of nowhere or it's just because. And on the flip side, like my daughter that I talked about, we're going to end up homeschooling her again because of the struggles she had last year. And I would say that she has that little T trauma from school because she felt like she was constantly on edge. Her sensory system was overloaded every single day. It was too loud. It was too bright. There wasn't a place she could go to settle her nervous system. And she didn't feel safe enough to raise her hand. And when she advocated for, I have a friend in the other class that when she sat next to me, I felt regulated and I felt like I could ask her questions and I felt really safe. They told us that we don't change kids for friends. Like we don't put them in other classrooms just for friends. I'm like, you're not hearing what she's asking for. And so my daughter had to go, we went through everything this last year and we ended up deciding, yes, I want friends and I want to be around my friends, but it is worth it to be at home and learn in a safe place and learn on my timing and get the amount of sleep that I need. And honestly, she can do her work in 2 to 3 hours.
Right.
And so why prolong that stress level of being in a situation that doesn't feel comfortable?
One of the things that I've learned as a clinician and as a parent and an educator is that when kids are heightened, there is a lot of value in, first of all, recognizing what my emotions are doing so that I can try to regulate those, but also less talking.
My gosh, yes.
Less can be more, especially when we're really heated up. And I feel like a lot of parents fall in this trap of talking too much and lecturing. Can you share a little bit about why it's helpful to just stop before it gets to that point?
100%. So in the book and in my work, we've developed these different plans, these stages that you go through. And most parents try to start at stage 4 or 5, which is ahead of the moment, which that's where you're going to skill build, you're going to problem solve, you're going to collaborate. And then the 5th stage, which is where we're setting up systems, maybe new routines or new schedules or new agreements or boundaries that we all agree on. But if you don't feel safe and your child doesn't feel safe, and I mean internally, not just like, oh, I have a roof over my head and I have a loving parent, but emotionally, psychologically, I feel safe in my skin and safe to be myself and safe to make mistakes. If that's not where we're sitting, then we can't access any of the problem solving. We can't access any of these great systems or strategies or tools that get put into place. And so the first 3 stages are really about that. What do we do in the worst of moments, right? You absolutely don't need to say anything. It's about getting to safety. It's not about fixing. It's not about solving, but it's how do we just ride through this? And I like to call it kind of the plan before you have a plan that works. And so, because, if you're listening to this episode and I share a plan for in the moment, you might go try it and it's still not going to work. And so you need something to still just get through the next moment and to get through that next argument, that next fight, that next frustration. And so that is more about just literally planting your feet in the ground and stopping all movement, stopping all talking, stopping all questioning and fixing, and then just taking your own deep breath. And it's like what you talked about, getting ourself calm first. But then on top of that, it's looking at our own body and saying, okay, even if we think we're calm, we could be sending messages with our nonverbal communication that we are not calm. So we might not be saying anything, but our body might be saying a lot. And our kids who are neurodivergent, a lot of times are way more receptive of our body language than we think that they might be. And so they're looking at our eyes, they're looking at our mouth, they're looking at our shoulders because they're looking for clues. Am I in trouble? Is she mad at me? What's she going to do next? And so they're looking for those clues. And so we have to start from head and go down our body while we're stopped. It gives us that time to kind of scan our body and swap out the signals we're sending in the heat of the moment so that we can ride that out and we're not actually adding fuel to the fire. The second stage is more about time and energy. And because if you don't have time and energy, you won't be able to do that pause. You won't be able to stop talking, right? If you're exhausted, you're going to say things that you didn't mean to say. If you're tired and depleted, and it's the 3rd meltdown of the day, you're not going to be able to just hold steady and not say anything or do anything, right? And so the in the moment plan, though, is what do I say and do? And that say is so it's so quiet. It's barely anything at all. So it's moving closer to our kids. And if we have a hitter or a kicker, obviously we're not going to move so close that they're hitting and kicking us. But we're moving into the same area and we're saying, I'm here with you. And that's it. We're just letting them know we're here. We hear that, for my daughter, I hear that you don't want to go to school. But we're not trying to solve why they don't want to go to school. Now, in our head, the thing we can do, because we are solvers and fixers as parents, is we can start going through a checklist of what could be going on so that when they're calm, we can start kind of solving the situation. But we have to wait until we're out of that situation to do anything involving fixing or solving.
Absolutely. It's been really wonderful to talk to you today. As you reflect on your own journey as a parent, you've been through a lot. I'm wondering if you could send a message about what you've learned to yourself as a younger parent, and you're just learning to navigate this path with your child. What is it that at that time you most needed to hear?
I actually pictured a moment in my home. My son was about 8, and I'm in his room, and he's getting picked up by his dad, And his dad would tell me all the reasons that what I did was wrong and that I should just spank him, or I should just take away his toys, or I should just put him in timeout. And it's not a very proud moment, but I remember in that moment holding him and he's throwing a fit. And I remember saying, well, everybody says I should spank you. And my son said, well, then do it. And I wish in that moment I had showed up to my younger self. And I wish then I could have walked in the door and said, stop. Trust that gut feeling. Parent him the way that feels aligned with what you believe and that supports him and connects with him. You don't have to listen to everybody else. You are the expert in your child, and you're not failing, and your child's not broken. You don't need to fix him. Just be there with him. And I think if someone had showed up in that moment and done that, I think I could have saved a lot of my heartache and saved a lot of the disconnection between my son and myself for a long time.
Dayna Abraham, author of Calm the Chaos. Thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you so much for having me.
There is so much pressure in the world to be a perfect parent. But of course, there is no such thing. The thing to remember is that you are exactly the parent your child needs. The fact that you are here, listening to this podcast, and you're trying to find ways to support them that will help them grow into content and independent adults is the biggest testament to the type of parent you are. And whatever the chaos is that you are dealing with today, all of your efforts to provide calm are incremental. And that change does accumulate over time, even if it isn't noticeable from day to day. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. I'll see you next time on the Neurodiversity Podcast.
Our thanks to Dayna Abraham. We have links in the show notes to learn more about her and her work. One of the ways we hope to end educational trauma is through sharing and education, and we're going to be doing a lot of that in our new Educators membership group. It'll be starting soon. There's a link in the show notes to get you on the list and be part of it. Our host is Emily Kircher-Morris. Our office manager and social media director is Krista Brown. I'm the executive producer, Dave Morris. For all of us, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time. This is a service of the Neurodiversity Alliance.